Ben Wattenberg. As you may have noticed, men look different from women. But do men and women think differently? If so, could these differences be hardwired in our genes and in our brains? What would that mean for women? What would that mean for men? Joining us to sort through the conflict and the consensus are Deborah Tannen, professor of linguistics at Georgetown University and author of You Just Don't Understand, Women and Men in Conversation, and Talking from 9 to 5. Robert Wright of the New Republic magazine and author of The Moral Animal, Why We Are the Way We Are, the New Science of Evolutionary Psychology. Lawrence Hedges, professor of social science and education at the University of Chicago and co-author of a major new study on gender differences. And Christina Sommers, professor of philosophy at Clark University and author of Who Stole Feminism? How Women Have Betrayed Women. The topic before this house is how different are men and women? This week on Think Tank. Boys are made of frogs and snails and puppy dog tails, and girls are made of sugar and spice and all that's nice. You know, for more than a quarter of a century, the women's movement has been chipping away at stereotypes like those. In America now, the economic, political, and professional imbalances between men and women are closing fast, but the evidence behind some of those stereotypes is mounting. Recent studies reveal that men and women use different parts of their brains for language. Girls are nearly twice as good as boys on many word choice tests, and girls are far more likely to be top scorers on writing tests. Boys are 7 times more likely than girls to score in the top 5% on science tests and twice as likely to score high on math tests. What about the mating game? According to a survey of 37 cultures, men tend to value physical attractiveness and youth when choosing a partner, while women are more concerned about status, ambition, and resources. What happens when social barriers to women fall? Since 1960, the share of women receiving medical degrees has increased 7-fold, while the number receiving law degrees has jumped 17-fold. Today, the majority of college students are women, who on the average receive better grades than their male counterparts. A few months ago, Speaker Newt Gingrich declared that men are biologically driven to hunt and kill giraffes, and that women were biologically unsuited to fighting in the trenches. Let's just go around the room once, starting with you, Deborah Tannen. How different are men and women?
The differences that I'm interested in are differences in ways of speaking, ways of using language in everyday life. There seems to be a tendency, and all of these are just tendencies, they're never absolute differences, tendency for women to focus more on the connection versus distance dimension, men to be somewhat more attuned to whether a way of speaking is going to put them in a one-down position, and many other differences we can talk about, ways of valuing the role of conversation in a relationship, ways of using language to accomplish your goals in everyday interaction.
Larry Hedges, you just co-authored a new study on this matter.
Yes, and the differences that we looked at were differences in intellectual functioning. And there, the short summary is that on the average, men and women are not that different in their intellectual functioning, with a few very stereotyped exceptions. But in spite of the fact that they aren't that different on the average, men tend to outnumber women substantially at both the top end of the distribution, that is, among very talented individuals, and also at the bottom end, among the anti-talented individuals, if you like.
Okay. Bob Wright.
Well, from the standpoint of evolutionary psychology, I guess the sex difference that most certainly has a genetic basis is in the realm of sex or romance. For example, men are less discriminating about sex partners, in some sense more polygamous, on average at least, than women. But the same logic that leads to that conclusion does extend to the question of aggressiveness. although I don't buy Newt Gingrich's explanation of exactly why that is in evolutionary terms.
You were permitted by your magazine to agree with Newt Gingrich periodically, right?
This was the one. This fulfills my yearly quota, actually.
Okay, all right, great. All right.
This issue of aggression may in turn extend into realms beyond physical combat, so that men, for example, Deborah's work suggests that they're more combative in conversation.
Who, us?
Exactly.
Right. Okay. Christina Sommers.
Yes, I think the differences can be exaggerated. I do not think that women think differently from men. I completely disagree with my colleagues in feminist philosophy who believe there is a special female epistemology, a female logic. This seems to me to be a nonsense. However, I do think there are rather strong differences in preferences between men and women, not romantically speaking, and even in the areas in employment, women gravitate towards jobs that seem to engage them more emotionally. You're going to always have probably more women as kindergarten teachers than helicopter repair, servicemen.
I often wonder why we are so obsessed with picking apart exactly how much is social and exactly how much is genetic. It must be some combination of both.
Yeah, right, but to answer your question as to why we are so obsessed about it, because starting in the 1960s, a very prominent group of women said there really were no differences. These were all socially imposed upon women, and they were harming women. So, I mean, I think that's the answer that we're in we're in this argument.
And that in itself is kind of interesting. I frequently am asked after I speak, are these differences you described biological or cultural? And I often find that the people who ask me think they know. They either are convinced it's all biological or they're convinced it's all cultural, and they tend to pattern by gender. It's usually the women who feel it's all cultural, and the men who ask me and have already decided that they think it's all biological. That in itself, to me, is an interesting cultural phenomenon. I suspect that the women are thinking, if we can say that there are really no differences, it's all cultural, then we can change everything we don't like about the world tomorrow. And on the other side, the feeling seems maybe if it's all biological, then if you women are in a subordinate position in the world, it's your own fault. We can't do anything about it, and don't blame me. And I think, in fact, neither of those is true. Cultural training is very hard to change, and biological training is very possible to change. I mean, what's more human than to go against our biological givens?
Bob Wright, where does the evolutionary psychologist come out on this?
Well, certainly not with the view that genes are destiny, but on the other hand, with the view that there are some inclinations which are fairly stubborn and that they will never be entirely defeated. And you ask why does it matter to what extent this is deeply biological? One example is I think for a while, 20 years ago or so, there was the idea that you could have a sexual morality that was premised on the idea that men and women are identical in the way they think about sex, in the way they react to sex. And that had a lot of effects. I actually think one of the effects it had was to alleviate, to free males from a kind of moral responsibility they'd previously been told they had, a kind of considerateness they had to extend to someone. For example, in realizing that sex might mean less to the male than to the female, and they should keep that in mind. So I think on the one hand, if males are aware of this, they can certainly, we can all control ourselves. On the other hand, there are some basic features of human nature that exist in cultures everywhere and are reflected in the moral systems that evolve culturally. And I think a robust moral system has to take into account basic differences that are going to be there to some extent or another.
Don't you think that may be a mistake that some feminists made? If there are these differences between men and women, and I think a bedrock difference is that men are stronger than women. Men can harm women, and there may have been a reason why we evolved certain customs and codes of civility.
Men don't bear children.
Men don't bear children, but codes of gallantry, showing gestures of respect towards women, those may have been very, very important to protect women, not to demean women, though there were demeaning aspects for sure. But I think as feminists, perhaps we were too hasty to disparage these customs and mores that served a very important purpose of protecting women from men.
And yet I would be worried if we jump too hastily to the conclusion that the differences that we observe between men and women are necessarily biologically based and immutable. That would freeze into place certain differences in the opportunity structure for men and women in society that we might not want to freeze into place.
Well, but I mean, now you're talking like a politician. You're supposed to be a social scientist, which is, we do not regard that as an oxymoron. So you shouldn't say what should be, but what is. Now, what does your study show? I mean, are there immutable differences? I mean, men do not bear children. That is a major difference in a human being's life.
Well,
and don't usually play the premier role in rearing them and nurturing them. That is another premier difference in the lives of men and women. I mean, can you then just say sort of politically, well, we should ignore that?
I'm not suggesting we should ignore that, but what I am suggesting is that when we observe differences that are as large as the ones we found in our study, differences of 2 to 1 or 7 to 1 in some cases, those kinds of differences could be used to suggest that it's all right if in science men outnumber women 7 to 1, and it's not a difference that we should particularly worry about. We shouldn't ask ourselves the question, could this be because there are more opportunities for men and more encouragement to go into science for men than women?
There's a danger that obvious differences, for example, women can give birth to, some women can give birth to babies and no men can. Obviously not all women do.
Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Arnold Schwarzenegger did in that movie, right?
Can be misinterpreted. For example, one of the early arguments against women receiving higher education was that all that blood supply that was going to be going to their brains when they did all this difficult intellectual work would be taken from the womb and would affect their childbearing capacities. So the question is still open. What are the impacts of these various differences? And I think they can be overinterpreted.
But I think the important thing is that we must believe in equality of opportunity. If a little girl is a math prodigy, then every classes should be available to her and she should be able to pursue her talent. Unfortunately, what's happening right now is many women's groups, in particular the American Association of University Women and a group called Fair Test, have said, aha, girls are not scoring the same as boys on the SAT and on the NAEPS. We have to change the test.
The NAEPS is the
National Assessment of Educational Progress.
Right.
And the girls are behind in math and science, therefore it is sexism at work, and they're actually changing SAT tests now in ways which to favor the girls, and there's the suggestion that they should take away time limits or they shouldn't reward boys for guessing. Now this is ridiculous. It's part of intelligence to make educated guesses and to be quick-witted. I mean, it just seems to me to be all wrong. It's the dumbing down.
It seems to me this is a very dangerous phenomenon because it leads to the idea of redefining the criterion not just for men and women, but for any groups that happen to be important in the society. And I think that's a serious mistake of shooting the messenger rather than trying to find out what we can learn from the message.
I wanted to say that you wanted to be kind of agnostic on the basis of cognitive differences between men and women, and that's actually true that from the point of view of evolutionary psychology, there aren't really clear reasons to predict very specific cognitive differences. That's not to say they don't have an evolutionary basis, but what is fairly likely is that in the realm of what you might call ambition, there is some difference between the average man and the average woman, and that's the kind of thing that could account.
What is the difference? Who is more ambitious?
Men. And in Deborah's work, men are bigger show-offs, and there's a fairly clear-cut evolutionary reason for this. And another related thing from an evolutionary standpoint is there's some reason to believe that parents may have an innate inclination to push boys harder, because during evolution, the social status of a son paid off in reproductive terms more than the social status of a daughter. Now that doesn't mean that parents are condemned to do this for eternity. In fact, in my own experience, I have 2 daughters. Being aware of this tendency, if anything, makes me actually want to combat it. I mean, give the daughter a fair shake. And to the extent that parents do that, then any difference in your findings, for example, that's due to parents pushing the males will disappear.
That men and women are equally ambitious, but for different goals? That a man may want to be the football star or the CEO, and a woman may be extremely ambitious mean, to go back an era or so, may be extremely ambitious to raise 3 children really well and have a home and a family and do things that, you know, are, in my judgment, more important than about 99% of the other kind of jobs. But
well, and to do things that are even less obviously related to kind of being a mother. But certainly, yes, my guess would be, based on evolutionary psychology, that in the realm of kind of being out there and seeking respect. Another difference you find is that men want respect and women want people to like them, at least on average.
In terms of percentages and degree.
Exactly. I mean, all of these are statistical differences. But in that realm, you would expect a difference in that direction.
You know what I find surprising, though? If you look at Department of Education data, more girls are going to college than boys. And they ask, were you encouraged to go? They ask counselors, were you encouraged by a teacher, a counselor, a parent? And far more girls claim to have been encouraged. So there may be something amiss in our society right now. As I'm a mother of 2 boys, so I'm the boys' advocate here. But I really feel that we are not encouraging our boys as much as our girls now, that boys are getting left behind. And there's I know a great deal of hype about the shortchanged, silenced girls, but if you actually look who's getting the better grades, it's the girls. Who's in most of the honors clubs and the service clubs and the school newspaper, it's girls are overrepresented. The one area where boys are overrepresented is sports, and the feminists are going after that with a vengeance.
And who gets in more trouble with drugs and crime?
Drugs and alcohol and delinquency dropping out. It's boys are overrepresented in those areas.
But the finding that women, that girls get better grades than boys is an old finding, and it goes way back to a time, I think, before the feminist revolution, and has persisted to this day in every area.
Better study habits.
Or greater task persistence, who knows?
But it doesn't mean that
or a innate difference.
But it
Could
does.
be also possible. Yeah.
Well, it doesn't. I mean, you poo-poo all the findings of the why girls fail stuff, and sure,
not all of them,
because you can pick out lots of them that I think have been misinterpreted. But there's a lot of stuff there I think that's very real.
Like what?
Example,
for example, the findings that girls are called on less in class.
No, look at the latest research. Jerry Brophy at Michigan State and Jacqueline Eccles. It's really a myth.
Well, I've been convinced by the research I've read.
Let's try. Yeah. What do they say, and then you tell me what
Jerry
is
Brophy
the counter argument
at
on this?
Michigan State says that boys get more attention because it's negative attention. They are disciplined more, and if you're sitting there observing, you will see, Johnny, what do you think is the capital of New York? It's a form of classroom management. So boys get, but what's important, according to Brophy and others, is the quality of the interaction, and there boys are not getting more qualitative.
Deborah Tannen, what do you think about that?
The research findings of the SATCRs, I'm sure
Where
you all
did the
know
SATCRs
them.
publish that data?
They've done, in their book called Failing at Fairness.
No, but I mean, what research journal? Where has their data ever been peer reviewed? It hasn't.
I've read their research and many others too.
No, that's what everyone thinks, that there are many others, but they're not there.
Well, I believe they're there. I mean, it's not my immediate field, but let me just say the kind of thing that they find is that if a boy asks a question, the teacher is more likely to ask him a challenging question, more likely to follow up with questions that challenge him.
Let me ask
and I observe this in my own classrooms. Young women in my own classrooms. I have classes of women and men. I've done my own studies on this too. I will often have 3, 4, 5 young women in the class who never speak in class. I very rarely have young men in the class that never speak in class. Women tell me that if they speak in class one day, they try to be quiet the next because they don't want to be seen as dominating.
In elementary and secondary school, at least, the vast majority of the teachers are women. So if there is a discriminatory act going on, it is women on women, right?
Well, that's very interesting because I think definitely a lot of the expectations that we have, which we foist on others. In other words, you expect a woman to be a certain way, you expect a man to be a certain way. It's equally true of women as it is of men. There's no reason that it shouldn't be.
Let me ask you a question as a social scientist. How much of the social science in America today is pre-driven? That, in other words, somebody is going in there with a liberal view or a conservative view and saying, here's what I'm looking to prove, and we all know you can jiggle a lot of these studies. And how much of it is the equivalent of a man or a woman in a white coat in a medical lab, checking everything one against another? Are the social sciences ideologically driven?
To some extent, of course, they are, and they have to be because it is social science. But many of the large data collection programs that are multi-purpose data collection programs are so large, involve so many different scientists, and have to be vetted by so many different interests that, in fact, I suspect many of those special interests and special perspectives kind of cancel one another out.
Insofar as what we've been talking about, what should we do about education? Let's go, this starting with you, Bob Wright, and come around this way.
Well, the policy prescription that's clearest to me and has some relevance to education is that if affirmative action for the sexes is to be based on the assumption that the sexes are identical in nature, so that any imbalance in the representation of males and females in a given workforce or at a given level is assumed to be due to discrimination, that is surely a faulty assumption. I really think from the point of evolutionary psychology you can say that. On the other hand, evolutionary psychology provides you reasons why an enlightened boss might, in some cases, in a sense, systematically favor women over men. It suggests that men are more likely to be egotistical in their pursuit of career advancement and even sacrifice the interests of the organization they're working for to their own personal interests than women are. This is not a 100% certain finding, but there's very good reason to believe it. So I think, in policy terms, this can in some senses cut against women, in some senses favor them.
Larry, Bob Wright has expanded the topic from education to education and affirmative action. Mm-hmm. Now, what should we be doing that we're not doing?
Given that we don't know that the differences are entirely biological, I think we should try to do more to equalize opportunity structures for men and women in education, first of all, in the long run.
And that would mean, for example, working harder with boys to become better writers.
As one of the prime examples.
Right. As well as girls to become better mathematicians.
Right. Exactly. But I would like to add that in the short run, the imbalance of very talented individuals, that is, the fact that there are more very talented men than women in areas like mathematics and science, has real implications for trying to achieve closer to a balance of representation of the genders in the sciences. It means that we either have to accept lower goals or recruit harder to get more women into the sciences.
Deborah Tannen?
I agree with what Bob Wright said earlier, that if there are differences, it's in everybody's interest to understand what they are and move on from there. I think that for work situations as well as classroom situations and home relationships, if we can see patterns and identify them, we can equalize opportunity by taking them into account. An example that has come up, there's very good evidence that men are more likely than women to be aggressive and to use open argumentation, and this could also be cultural because it may not be true of Japanese and other cultures, but in the Western society, the open exchange of argument as a way of learning things is much more congenial to the men than the women. And this could be one reason that many women back off in a classroom that is taught that way. And there's a fair amount of evidence that women often drop out of science classes because they don't like that argumentative classroom atmosphere and they're uncomfortable with it. Well, that's a way you could start out, not lowering the requirements for how much a scientist has to know to get this job, by no means, but creating an environment that women might be more comfortable getting the scientific training and might not drop out.
Christina?
I think one thing that's very important is a lot of the research on gender in the last 10 or 15 years has been done by feminist advocates who are committed to a sort of victim feminism, and the research cannot be trusted. They exaggerate women's vulnerability, they exaggerate women's oppression, and I hope that politicians and journalists will be careful to get to the more balanced scholars, because I think in education we're not getting a good accurate picture. I think when it comes to gender bias in the workplace we're not getting an accurate picture. We have to get to the, as I said, to the more solid research.
Okay. Thank you, Christina Sommers, Lawrence Hedges, Robert Wright, and Deborah Tannen. Thank you. Please send your comments and questions to New River Media, 1150 17th Street, Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. We can also be reached via email at thinktank@pbs.org or on the World Wide Web at www.pbs.org. No matter what you choose to contact us, please don't forget to tell us where you are calling from. For Think Tank, the father of 3 daughters and 1 son, I am Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.